in the first few minutes, I'll do an introduction of you both. Lesley, I just want to make sure, how do you pronounce your last name correctly?
Pruitt.
Pruitt? Okay, perfect. Awesome.
I thought you were going to ask me how you pronounce my last name, not Lesley.
Oh, actually, that's a good question. I'll hear, how do you pronounce it correctly? I don't want to get it right.
Mark, Chou.
Chou, okay, yeah. Perfect. Awesome. So thank you both for being here. So for those who are kind of joining us, we're joined with Dr. Lesley Pruitt from the University of Melbourne, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Social and Political Sciences. And we have here as well Associate Professor Mark Chou from the University, Australian Catholic University, and is Associate Professor of Politics there as well. So Lesley and Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Great to see you all.
Yeah, thank you. And just as we get started, I would like to do just a quick acknowledgement of country. So acknowledge that we are on the kind of lands of the First Nations people, and here in Melbourne, we are on the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So thank you both for being here. So as kind of discussing with Mark, since the time in which we've contacted you to have this chat with you, the world's kind of been really changing, especially when it comes to kind of youth political participation and protests and everything going on. So I guess just to get a bit of what are your impressions of what's kind of going around in terms of kind of young people getting involved with the protests, Black Lives Matter, the Aboriginal movement here in Australia? What are your impressions so far?
Do you want to go, Mike, maybe first, and then we go with you?
All right, I'll go first. Yes. So it's an incredibly uncertain time, and I guess from a period, it's not all that long ago, when people were just greatly unsure of how to behave with each other. Like, we were stuck at home. When we ventured out, we were quite fearful, and not knowing what the next stage held. To what we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks with the rise in global protests, pretty much on a scale that we haven't seen for quite some time. And we can say that, from what we've been seeing, it's young people again who are taking the lead, being at the forefront, pushing the agenda, making their voices heard on a range of really important issues. Particularly in the US, I guess right now there is a US election in play. It's a very different election again. It's kind of been kind of muted in many ways. But I think with the global protests starting from the US, we are starting to see, I guess, more pressure being exerted on not just Donald Trump, but on Biden as well, Joe Biden as well, to kind of discuss the issues which have been quite pressing in American society for a very long time. And here in Australia, the protests that we've been seeing across the country, again, disproportionately, we are seeing young people taking to the streets and bringing a really important issue to the forefront. And it's great to see.
What about you, Lesley?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Mark said. I think this is a really poignant example of young people making their voices heard on issues that are really important for social and political change. And I think that we can see often historically in times of sort of major crisis, it's also potential for times of major transformation. And that and unfortunately, in many ways, all these devastating issues are being exacerbated and brought to bear at this time, and young people are using that opportunity to push for transformational change, to speak up about what's not working. And I think in the case of the sort of pandemic situation, there's been a lot of discussion about trust in government and public institutions, which was really critical for people having buy-in, for example, to follow public health directives. There was a lot of discussion about what young people would do, or sort of public mentions of young people being the risky groups going out and doing things, but also a lot of discussion about the disproportionate ways that young people were affected. And I think they're again finding that space for transformation and actually pushing some of the reasons why that lack of trust in government or state institutions might be there. And these protests are one really crucial example of that, of a place where state institutions are failing to hold the trust of their citizenry, or failing to be representative of their citizenry. And that's why people are pushing to make that change, to see a better world for this generation and the generations to come after them.
Definitely. I think we can definitely agree with that. And we've seen how, I guess, like echoing what you were saying, Mark and Lesley, this protest kind of just the symbol of we've had enough is enough. We have this trust in politicians, and we're just going to do what we got to do for the issues that really matter to us. And I think that's the overall feelings that young people have felt as well from all our conversations with them.
And I guess hearing you both speaking, Mark and Lesley, there's remember this point that you made in the book you both wrote, Young People, Citizenship and Political Participation. And it was a point on the comparison of, when the baby boomers were actually protesting against, in the US, against the involvement in the Vietnam War. And it's an interesting contrast, back then they were also accused of, going against the system and, not participating in what was seen as traditionally, appropriate ways, voting and political parties and petitioning. And in the book you say that, this marks now what's known as kind of cause-orientated politics. Young people are no longer really sticking towards traditional methods of engaging in politics. So I guess, what do you see, has anything changed from that time? Is there any big difference from the young people protesting now to when the baby boomers were protesting, things like the involvement in the Vietnam War?
I think there's a big difference in the awareness of what's going on with politics. And that's not just for young people, but that's a generational change that's happened in our broader political culture, with the 24-hour news cycle, the sort of different expectations and awareness that citizens might have of what's going on in politics, changing of different ways that might be arguably democratization of knowledge and sharing, of ways that people can spread ideas more rapidly and more widely today and get engaged in those. So different types of platforms that young people and people of all ages use to share those things, which bring both opportunities and challenges, and are interconnected to those more traditional or non-traditional political protests, but that are longer running, like protests.
I guess I would just add that what happened during the 1960s and 70s with a lot of the youth protests and the movements that we saw during that time, there was a great backlash by the political elite of the day. And they tried to intervene to delegitimize what these young people were doing. And one of the ways was to actually change the way that we educate young people in schools and in universities in Western liberal democracies. And it took, what I'm trying to say is that the push was to try to get them to be less radical, less critical, less free thinking. And, to some extent, the education that we have had of the last couple of decades have been as a result of that. You've seen young people discouraged from doing things like this. But despite it all, we still see, examples every now and then of young people rising to the fore, pushing back against the elites, the power brokers, pushing back against government to make their voices heard. So this is kind of an ongoing thing. So we're still seeing this today. And, every time we see youth speak up, whether it be through protests or some other means, you'll see government officials, you'll see educators kind of push back and say, you should stay in school. This is not for you. This is, you're too young to get involved in these issues. So the similarities in some ways are there between what happened in the 60s and 70s and what's happening today as well, where you're always going to get pushback when young people speak up, which is an irony because politicians often moan about the fact that young people aren't politically engaged enough. And yet when they do, they also get slapped down for kind of doing politics the wrong way. So very interesting, set of problems we see from the 60s still playing out today in some ways.
Yeah. It's a really great segue to kind of one of the, I think, the main focuses of the book that you both wrote, which is young people's citizenship and political participation. It's the idea that, particularly in countries like UK, US, and Australia, that this idea of correcting the youth civic deficit by means of reforming constantly the civics education. And interesting, based on that, Mark, would you say that, and Lesley, would you say that that movement to kind of try to make, young people less radical and focusing on that means via civics education, was that successful, or is what we're seeing now simply that it kind of just held it back until now it's kind of coming out to the forefront and it's really just bursting at the seams?
Well, I guess this is a very tricky question and an issue that we've been seeing play out for the last 20, 30 years at least. I guess the Commonwealth Government has had an interest in revamping civics education really probably most strongly since the bicentenary. Every time there's an interest in civics education from the Commonwealth Government, it seems to be about making young people embrace some national identity or ethos to try and get them to embrace politics in that most narrow sense of when they turn 18, they will vote at an election, ideally engage in party politics of some sort. But I guess, the education reforms that have followed have been in line with that to try and get young people familiar with the formal institutions of politics in Australia, how parties are formed, what happens when you go to an election, things of that nature. But it really only speaks to a very, I guess, limited aspect of what young people actually do and care about in their everyday lives. And there's this great disservice that we do in the sense that by privileging or preferencing this formal type of politics, we also delegitimize everything else that they care about, which is also political, which is also politics. And there's this misunderstanding or misconception that flows through that, my life has nothing to do with politics. What I'm interested in is not about politics, when it in fact is. And I think the key to civics education is to try and be more holistic in that sense, to try and help young people to see that what they are interested in their everyday lives, diverse as it might be, is actually fundamental to how politics is done in this country, or any country.
I think that really ties down to the statement you guys wrote in the book about elitism, only capturing those people who are interested in politics from the first place, or only the ones who are initially interested in politics, and those are the voices that we're going to keep hearing in politics, and those who are not feeling politics is the area or the arena they're interested in don't feel like their issues matter to the politics, so they have to go and voice out their own opinions in their own ways. And we're going to create the same limited number of people who are involved in politics, the same kind of people, and that's eventually not representative of the whole politics view in Australia or in any country.
I think that kind of ties in with the point I think you're alluding to, Mark, which is the idea of this false idea that you're either, this is what politics is, and it's in a specific certain realm of your life, and it doesn't include any other part of your life. So then you have, this understanding now. It's like, this is politics, and if I'm not part of it, it's like, I guess I'm not political, and it's a really big problem now. And I think that's something we've experienced ourselves, and also working with a lot of young people is this idea of, I'm a mechanic or I'm a psychology student. What do I have to do with politics? This idea that we've created this false dichotomy between what is political and not political. I guess turning to you, Lesley, what do you see in terms of the role of the last, let's say, 30 years of civics education and reform across US, UK, and Australia in terms of what is happening now with youth frustrations, the protest movements?
Well, it's very hard to necessarily against that in the sense because we don't know what people are taking from civics education that they have or don't have in a particular situation. But some people who are doing civics education might say this is a very good example of people putting into practice doing citizenship.
Mm.
I guess that'd be a very specific case relevant to what kind of education particular people have had in different places. But I guess something that will be worth reflecting on is thinking about, yes, what is done in terms of that civic education, how is it done, and what are the ends of it. And I think kind of going back to what Mark was talking about is that often there's the case that, it's said, when young people are doing some kind of protest or situation, it's said that's not the right way, write a letter, wait to vote, etc. But putting it in that narrow way, it can also be a way of disengaging people and not doing anything. I think of like Sarah Ahmed, who's a feminist theorist, and she talks about how sometimes institutions do things to avoid doing things. So, we can say, oh, but you have this opportunity here, so therefore there's this, but there's not any question about what might need to change within the institution or the process to make those institutions and processes more inviting, more welcoming, more opening spaces to a range of different people and a range of different young people. And so I think it's important that we try to think about how that can happen in practical, everyday ways that bring those kind of concerns and practices of young people into the existing institutions and change the institutions to make space for them.
That's such a good point.
And
I love that point that you've made, Lesley, about it's almost that, the right to protest is something which is, often that we're taught about in civic education, this is a fundamental right, you can go and protest, and yet when young people tend to you exert that right, use that right, it's kind of, oh no, you're doing politics wrong, you should be doing petitioning, or you should be doing formal letters or voting, and yet it's kind of this weird frustration. And I think it's particularly confusing or an interesting example during COVID, because now there's not only that element already of like, we want to protest for this, and it's seen as not as we can say an adequate or an appropriate form of political expression, but now we have the whole health concern as well, where the state is responsible for not only listening to the concerns of the citizens, but also, looking after the health and well-being of the citizens during COVID. So I guess for both of you, what do you think, as lockdowns are easing and, kind of into the era of post-lockdown COVID, what is the number one thing that needs to change to improve that youth participation? And as you said, Leslie, to create space within those institutions that allows for this, a much more effective means of youth participation?
I think one key thing is the need to be intentional. So these things aren't going to happen by themselves. They have a commitment to engaging young people and a diverse range of young people. And I think it's important for the state and various institutions of it, including civic education approaches, that we don't approach that in a box ticking way. It's very easy to get these sort of targets of also, well, let's get X number of young people, and now we got that. So we can assume that we know what all young people want. We've asked some young people, but again, that might be the usual suspects, as you've sort of spoken of, who might in no way be representative of young people more broadly. So I think it's got to be that intentional, ongoing commitment. Rethinking those ideas about young people to ask, what are young people doing? What are young people interested in, and how can they be engaged? Approaching that in some more creative ways. And so I guess what I would say then is the sort of number one thing is an engaged commitment that's to a plural range of approaches that are about actively committing to engaging young people in a broad range of ways.
And just to clarify, Leslie, when you say a broad range, are you talking about the kind of the sample of young people that are being targeted, or also the channels by which you target those young people?
Both, because I think different young people will be engaged in different ways. For example, like when I've worked in different programming with young people, it's about engaging them in particular, political and social areas for change. Like a lot of peacebuilding programs I've worked with. And a number of those programs, for example, use different creative means to engage young people in the community. Music, dance, theater, all kinds of range. And often when you ask young people about why they got involved and what they wanted to do after, there'd be many young people who would say, I wasn't involved in anything to do with peace building before this. I got involved because I wanted to make a hip hop album, or I wanted to do whatever. But actually they do care about all those issues, and they gain this sort of peer network through working creatively with their peers. And then there were ways they wanted to go on and use that skill and knowledge and share those things. So it was about that they had the chance to see that their existing skills and knowledge and resources could be valued and could be shared, and that they could be leaders amongst their peers and share that in their community. And they do want to keep doing that. So I think finding those ways that can engage young people in ways that they care about and are interested in, instead of ways that might be quite alienating, are important to have, and that they usually will bring a broader range of young people together than just those who might want to already have an interest in attending a youth parliament, for example, which is also, can be a really important contribution.
What about you, Ma? What would you say the number one thing that needs to change in youth participation?
Well, I'm not sure it's so much change, but to re-emphasize, I guess, the ideal of representative democracy and policy making is really just, we need to engage with those most affected by a particular issue. And when we think about COVID, there's a range of issues that fundamentally affect young people's lives and their outlooks. So earlier this year, UNICEF did a survey of young people, and of the age group 13 to 17. They asked the question, how many of you are able to cope with life? It was just a very general question. And prior to COVID, this UNICEF survey found that 81% of 13 to 17-year-olds said that they were, quite able to cope with what life was throwing at them. But as of April, that number more or less halved. So 45% of 13 to 17-year-olds felt that they were able to cope with life in this pandemic or post-pandemic. So they're being fundamentally challenged. The conditions that we are now facing really have changed, all aspects of not just their lives, but their future as well. So when we think about jobs, a lot of young people are precariously employed in sectors that basically have been shut down as a result of this pandemic. Young people in schools, in universities, in TAFEs, how we learn has fundamentally changed as well. This has been for the younger students through to university-age students. There's a lot of issues associated with not just, I guess, physical health, but mental health from the social isolation that we've all been experiencing, and that's disproportionately been affecting young people. And just, I guess, more broadly, with arts and culture, how those sectors have ground to a halt. Young people kind of experience life through the arts, through culture, probably more than some of the older generations are experiencing differently. And that's changed as well. So if you're thinking about engaging with those most affected on these issues, governments, policymakers need to reach out. They need to engage these young people in discussions about how we move forward as a society, as a country, to start, I guess, tackling the issue of job losses, to tackle the question of how we do education differently in this environment. And I think we talked about it briefly, that some people just aren't wealthy enough to have good internet access, and if all education is online and your internet is patchy, you just can't do it. These are the questions that we need to engage young people. How have you experienced these problems, and what solutions would help you overcome the challenges that you face?
And I think that point is really one of probably the biggest points that you made in the book, which is the conclusion of, we need to move to more of a co-design process in future, where, you're actually engaging with the stakeholders who are most directly affected by issues, and in this case, by young people. And, given the benefits, you've mentioned about, co-design, that you can have more creative and fluid policy. There's the mutual learning between young people and decision makers. There's the breakdown of those negative stereotypes, so that young people are just naive and rebels, and then policymakers are just arrogant and don't want to listen to us. I guess I'll chuck this to you, Lesley. Like, how can we present these benefits of co-design, or make the case for co-design moving forward, so that we actually do have a new norm or status quo of co-design that's kind of embedded in the way that we make policy, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that were kind of made. And when we, as the book describes with civics education, the way that the states viewed civics education was, this is the path to, getting young people more engaged, but they continuously did not actually engage as young people in the design of that curriculum. So how do we not repeat those mistakes and make the case for both young people and decision makers to co-design moving forward?
I think it will differ in how we present it to both young people and decision makers, or existing political decision makers, because it might approach it from different angles. But the thing that's shared is about that there's a shared benefit for both young people and for policymakers. I think one thing that I would add there, building on what Mark was saying before and what we were talking about with engaging a range of young people, for example, like we have in the current context, young people being disproportionately economically affected by the current situation. And we also know that different groups of young people are differently affected. And then if you can engage and have that direct interaction and those stories with those different groups of young people, it can benefit by having better policies created to support all those young people. And ideally, policymakers, that's what you want, right? Is to be representing adequately your constituents. That's your duty, that's your job. So we can think, for example, in Australia, our own government has acknowledged that young women in particular were disproportionately impacted by job losses in the sector. And we've seen reports similar on that in the US and the UK. So young people in general, and young women in particular, based on the industries that they worked in. And then, you've seen the news in the last couple of weeks that childcare workers were one of the first people excluded from the support schemes by the government. Overwhelmingly disproportionate employer of young women, and also supporter of young women who have care responsibilities in the workforce. And the sort of tagline investment for specific industry was in the construction industry, which overwhelmingly disproportionately is more likely to employ men. So, there was a lot of sort of blowback in responses to this, and the discussion of how is this being proportionally targeted to getting broad support for people across the economy and young people across the economy. And I think you would probably have some more engaged perspectives if a range of people, young men and women, and young people from all different backgrounds are engaged in those sort of policy approaches that you're taking. So I think for co-design approach to policy, it's not about young people just benefiting or policymakers just benefiting, but it's also about creating those new kinds of spaces, transforming the institution by creating new kinds of spaces where both of those groups can gain from the outputs. So co-design might be thought about as a fairly new approach when it comes to policy, but it's worth remembering that it actually builds on a lot of prior work around participatory approaches. And so it works to try to avoid some of the practices that have been associated with earlier critiques of participatory approaches. So if you're doing co-design for policymaking, for example, you wouldn't be going to draft a policy, plan for its implementation, and then say you've done participation, because you held a consultation that was basically asking a few young people to rubber stamp what you've already decided. And that's the kind of thing that's been very rightly criticized in the past as being deemed as participation. So the idea with co-design is that you would be approaching the policy questions with young people from the beginning, that they're involved from the get-go, and so that you can actually try to understand people's range of needs rather than assuming what they are. And in that way, you have a better chance to meet those needs and thus improve lives, improve lives across the board for everybody. And to do that means that decision makers need to work to build trust, and young people would have to engage in that way with them. So it'd be useful to be able to share with both sort of examples of where that's worked or what their expectations are from the beginning as well.
I think that's a really good point of, I think a lot of youth participation approaches, it's a tick in the box. So as long as you have, at some stage of the decision-making process, you have young people involved in some stage of it, that's a tick in the box. So you've done participation. And I think you were saying, Lesley, it's not as effective as in making them involved from the very beginning to actually understand their perspective from the very beginning. And from your earlier point of being able to engage different young people for different issues, really, we can definitely echo that sentence, because that if we don't try to involve different kinds of young people, I guess that also creates an inequality as well. Like we say with like young women, if we just have a engagement with, you know, in terms of the support for construction workers, that's essentially basically men, and we're not involving young women. What about them? It's a same set of approach. So being engaged in different kinds of young people, and also being having them involved from the very beginning of the process. I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
And there's so much of a resonance with that idea with something that's kind of quite key in the entrepreneur world, which is the idea of, you know, understand your customer or your user, you know, and all their needs and wants, and then create something that you think will be useful for them, rather than assuming, as you said, Lesley, what you think in this case, young people want, and then doing it for them, because then often that is when there's a backlash, because it's not only that we haven't been involved, but there's a presumption of you think what's best, and actually often doesn't resonate or doesn't align with those needs. You know, turning to kind of you, Mark, is there anything that you want to add on top of what, you know, Lesley said around how do we, you know, like, it's not make the case for co-design, but, you know, ensure, like, what will that look like moving forward, and how do we present it in a way that it is mutually beneficial, or rather highlights the mutual benefits for both policymakers and young people, and how can we do that?
Yeah, what Lesley has said has already been really, really good. I think she's provided a very clear, I guess, outline of what co-design is, and some of the, I guess, precursor methods that we've been using to engage young people in participation. I guess what I would add is maybe a little more crude, in the sense that, you know, co-design sounds great in theory, and we've written about it, and it's something that we strongly believe in. But for it to actually work, it needs to be more than just hearing what young people have to say, as you kind of put it, as a box ticking exercise. You know, we've all had those experiences where we've been asked to give our opinions, whether through surveys or other means, and we just don't know what happens to these things that we kind of spend our times discussing and thinking about and providing feedback. It seems like more often than not, that nothing actually changes. We just kind of do this, and then, yeah, we go on our merry lives. And for co-design to actually work, it can't just be that. Sometimes it can be. Sometimes people just want to be heard. They just want to be in a space where they can discuss things. So that's something that policymakers or those engaged in this activity need to kind of be aware of. Sometimes that's enough. But I guess more often than not, people want to see what happens, what changes take place. So there needs to be some accountability that what you do, what you give to us in terms of your life experiences, your perspectives, something actually needs to be done with that. It's not just we will put it in a file and keep it there. You know, your voice has been heard. Thank you for participating. And that's really hard because, you know, there is a lot of pressure on various institutions to kind of tick these boxes, and they'll do it without actually intending to do anything with it. So what I'm saying is that, you know, for co-design to actually work, people need to be serious about it. Otherwise, it's probably something that you might want to avoid, because after a while, it kind of, the strength or the point gets diluted. If you're just going to do this and nothing happens, then why are we going to spend our times getting involved? Why are we going to put our effort into discussing these issues? Like, sometimes discussing issues that are really tricky is quite a painful thing. You don't want to do it. And when you do, you kind of hope that something will come of it. So it's kind of just, I guess, nothing really to add to what Lesley's saying, but just a point of caution for institutions, for companies, organizations who do this, to do it with the right intention of moving forward. It's not always going to be easy. The changes will be slow, but you've got to keep people informed of what you're actually doing with the insights that they've provided you, how you use them to try and take the next step, piecemeal as it might be.
I guess this is a follow-up question to that, Mark, but thank you so much. That was really excellent, definitely. And follow-up to you, Mark and Lesley as well. As Bridging Us, we connect young people to decision makers. So we really want some effective outcome to be out there for both sides, for both young people and decision makers. And I think accountability has been one of the most important things that came up from our conversations with other young people. They want to know what their voices are doing, what happened to those voices that they've given to them. And so how do we ensure that we can keep organizations accountable with that youth participation, with the voices that we've given to those organizations? How do we keep them accountable? How do we make sure that they're doing something with those voices and not just a ticking box? Well, yeah, with Mark or Lesley.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I think it's not something that you really need to worry about on the one hand with organizations that really want to do this in a genuine sense. They will basically come up with the goods and tell you about it, or keep you engaged and involved throughout the whole process if they really, value what you're saying and want to include you from the beginning to the end. You might not hear from them for months on end, but they will come back to you, say, this is the next step we've taken. What do you feel about it? Or actually say, this is what we've done. Can you see any way of making it better? So for organizations like that, you're probably, fine to kind of, let them be. But I do think that we need to keep institutions, organizations accountable, and maybe one of the things to do is to write into the agreement that, the process is not just a box ticking exercise. It's not just this one-off thing. It's not just something that you do to get insights from young people and basically extract from them their knowledge and leave them none the better off. There has to be some continual processes. You have to actually give back. You have to actually do something for them in return. So there's a quid pro quo type arrangement, and it's not, it doesn't necessarily have to be money or anything like that, but there has to be some commitment that we value your insights. We are going to do something for you, for what you care about, for the thing that we care about together. So it has to have, there has to be some sort of ongoing commitment.
And as you kind of said, like making it a part of that process, that part of the institution or the agreements that, what happens afterward will actually either have you involved or at least you'll be notified of what. In cases, young people in focus group settings, interview settings will contribute, but then will not know what the outcome of that was. And Imana and I have both been in those situations many times as a frustration, and it's this idea of, we're not just contributing for the sake of contributing. We do want to make an impact, and there may very well be an impact, but if you're not really kept in the loop, then your assumption is that, well, this probably didn't go anywhere. It's just archived away somewhere. I guess, Lesley, turning to you, what and adding to what Mark says, anything you can add in terms of how we can hold organizations, institutions, and policymakers accountable as they, if they are implementing these participatory methods or co-design methods in the way that they are developing solutions.
Yeah, I agree with what Mark said, and I guess some key sort of points I would add on there or further add there is that it's important that organizations, institutions, decision makers are taking an approach that's not extractive. I guess it's kind of building on some of what Mark was saying, but that it's framed in a way that's about mutual benefit and based on respect. And I think that's important because all generations in our society share the present and we share the future. And we know young people are going to have, again, disproportionate effects of some of those things longer term than some older people because they'll be living longer. But there's reasons why young people matter now and in the future, and that the organizations, the institutions, the state needs to value young people. That's a word that Mark used, and he said it doesn't have to be money, but I kind of want to push on that and say, well, yes, no, put your money where your mouth is. That's the thing I'm often
We all
about,
want money,
because,
Lesley. So.
participation, you know, can be you're coming and you're sharing something, but that's not the same as you have some power over a budget. You have a vote on something. So I think policy needs young people. Our future and our current policy both need the insights from young people who are going to bring those differing perspectives. And, you know, there are cases around the world where there are councils that are having a dedicated budget that young people get to decide what's happening with that money. There are councils that are employing young people to co-design policy. So I'm saying, yeah, put your money where your mouth is, pay those young people and value their time. There's often this idea that like young people just have infinite free time. Well, maybe if you're an independently wealthy young person, but most young people need some income. They need to work. So I think there needs to be an investment in making sure that they have that their time is valued, that their input and knowledge is valued, and that there's opportunities for that training and education and experience through those processes.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh no, I was thinking about this, and that's a really good point, Lesley, because in our earlier conversations with one of our friends who has been involved in social impact, wasn't involved before, and one of his point was saying, yeah, if you don't pay young people to give their opinion, to give their knowledge, to be part of co-design, you're missing out other most young people, because if you don't pay them, young people need to live as well. They need to earn some money at some way. So the people that you can essentially engage are the ones that are able to voluntarily.
I just stalled out. I missed that last bit.
We're back. It froze a little bit.
Can you both hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Your picture's frozen, but we can hear you. Oh, now you're moving.
You're back.
Perfect.
Yeah, so it ties down really like to your point, Lesley, about, again, like inclusivity, about engaging the different kinds of young people, but you can only do that if you're able to give valuation to them. What's value to them might be different as well. Money might be valuable to some young people, whereas other might just be opportunity. So yeah.
And it really goes to something that's been, you know, you've both been really touching upon, this idea of ingraining mutual learning and mutual respect as a key part of, you know, if you're going to do this, as you know, like I said, it's like, if you're not going to do it right, don't do it at all. But if you are going to do it, a key part has to be a sense of mutual respect. And it's quite interesting how, you know, as adults, we wouldn't be part of focus groups or, you know, things that are quite serious or as forms of employment. We wouldn't do that without fair remuneration. And yet we expect a different standard for young people. And as Imana is saying, that, you know, when that does happen, you are excluding young people who actually can't afford to participate unless they're being paid for it or given some other opportunities as a result. So this includes, you know, those who are rural, regional, you know, areas, or young people, or, you know, who've actually perhaps moved to the city to study, and then, you know, they have to actually work the rest of the time as on top of their study. They don't have the luxury of being involved. Likewise, international students who don't have the luxury of, you know, being involved in these activities because they might have to work, they might have to study to ensure that their grades are adequate, you know, because they're them studying there is contingent upon their grades. So, you know, it ends up restricting that and furthering the sense of elitism, in the sense of only a certain niche of young people are able to be involved. And Imana and I are both very conscious that we also are part of that. You know, we're very fortunate that we had the time and energy and the willingness to be involved and, you know, volunteer when we were in university, but so cognizant of the fact that a lot of people, or other young people, don't have that luxury. And so I guess, like, on that point, you know, what, if we kind of just a little bit touch upon that, how do we ensure moving forward that we aren't actually just getting that niche group of young people, that elite group of young people who can have the means or the interest to actually be involved in this? How do we prevent that from happening?
I think this was touching upon maybe a point that you made earlier, but we need to, I guess, get away from a preconceived notion of what politics should be. I think that's a very crucial point. When we do that, we kind of are much more able to unlock the political insights of a range of young people into things which they don't see as being political. So we are, I talk about this with my students all the time, that, even students who study politics often don't have a very, diverse interest or appreciation of how what they do in their everyday lives matters politically. They think of politics as what happens on Spring Street or in Canberra, but out in the suburbs, with their friends and what they do, they don't see that as being political. And when that happens, we kind of dissociate our lives, what we do, from what happens in the political realm. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you want young people to be involved, you have to speak to the things that they see as being most important in their lives, and try and, I guess, try and make that part of the debate, the discussion. And they will see, hang on, I know about this. This is going to matter to me, and I want to, chip in and provide my opinions, because I'm going to benefit from this. If you're talking about something that happens in the CBD or happens nationally, internationally, you're probably not going to catch most of the young people who aren't already politically engaged. So we need to kind of broaden our notion of what politics is and how it's done. And it's done in the suburbs, it's done online, it's done everywhere where young people hang out. And I think that's a crucial first step.
Yeah. So to usually, what can we do, and particularly from a decision maker, if we're thinking from the policymakers perspective, what can policymakers do to really start to break down those kind of idea of a separate political realm versus every other part of life?
I guess we've touched on that in a few different ways, trying to think on this specific questions. I guess I would say to the policy experts, for those that do already have a commitment to this and an experience, and there are, and Marco and I have, spoken before parliamentary inquiries, including with, young elected officials and policymakers who are working to try to get more young people in there, and who are working with allies of different ages within the sphere of formal politics to try to find different ways to engage young people. But is for those who are interested in this, I think can find different ways of connecting with their colleagues. But for those who are interested, and I guess we need to convince them of why should they care about young people, is saying that just the reminder basically that young people are key stakeholders, are key members of your constituency now and or in the future in your society. They deserve to be included in policy making, again, to ensure it meets their needs now and the future. And I guess just to share some of that information, that while there's often this assumption made that young people are politically disengaged or politically ignorant or apathetic, to point out the body of research that shows that stereotype is inaccurate. And really suggested it's probably often more of a cause of the political disengagement as these sort of attitudes towards young people. And recognizing the exclusions of those traditional political systems, the way that they're functioning in ways that are not always effective, representative, or demonstrating respect. And that's a problem that people across generations or sort of age cohorts point to in their sort of feelings towards, government and the state and our democracy. So it's important for political decision makers to take that time to reflect, to rethink, and critique those stereotypes that they might hold, and ask how they might work together with young people to change the existing systems, to make them more inviting, and to engage in some kind of shared leadership, to recognize that they can learn things from young people too. In some of the research I've worked on in the last few years around young people and leadership, we found all different kinds of attitudes by people of different age groups, because there's just often this assumption that young people can't lead. And it was quite interesting. In some contexts, we would hear when there was approaches to mentoring, there was automatically on some people's part this idea that the mentoring would be from, you know, the older person who's got all these years of experience. But often those who engaged in intergenerational mentoring found that there was so much they could learn and share from each other, because young people do have experience. It's often different experience or differently placed, but often have a lot of skills and knowledge and things that can be shared. And when people take that chance, take that positive risk together, and they get that experience, it's quite easy to see, I think. So I guess it's encouraging people to take a positive risk.
Turning to you, Mark. So this is something that we've, you know, been considering a lot in the range of our work, is that how do we articulate the benefits to decision makers and policymakers, as, you know, in the most, I guess, simple or crude way. It's like, you know, what is in it for you? Like, why should you care about young people? And Lesley, you've talked about some really good points there, particularly around the sense of mutual learning, and that they're also a very key stakeholder for you and will always be a key stakeholder for you. Mark, is there any other things you could add to that in terms of what are key points that can be made, or key arguments that can be made to policymakers in terms of why they should engage, work with young people?
Yeah. I think it's going to differ from organization to organization and person to person in charge. And this is, I guess, something that your organization really can do for young people and can do for these organizations, is to kind of bridge that gap. You need to sell the benefit that, you know, the insights that young people can bring to the particular organization. So there's no, I guess, generic answer that I can proffer here. It's going to actually be quite specific. Some organizations are going to be engaged in, you know, environmental issues, some in corporate issues, some in social justice issues. And there are different things that, I guess, young people's lives, I guess how they live their lives, that's going to be important to these organizations. And it's not always going to feature in the public policy debates that they will be aware of, in the kind of newspaper articles that they will read, or in the research that's out there. So you can sell it to them in the sense that you're actually missing out on a whole bunch of important information and important insights, because the data that you're using has, in essence, not tapped into the people who, I guess, can provide you with just this different look on things. Young people can do that from for a range of different reasons. What are these reasons? Again, they're going to be different for different organizations. So I think for your organization, for your, I guess, what you're doing, this is really where you can step in to do that work for both the young people and for the organizations that you're tackling. Do the research and then sell the benefits to them, that these young people can really bring these insights that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. And I think that would be something that they will go, potentially we could use some young people for this or that project. We could, because we're lacking that information, we're lacking those perspectives. So make that connection.
Yeah, thank you, Mark and Lesley. That's really good points from both of you. And I guess, conscious of time, this is our last question for you both. Given your interest, especially from the book that you both wrote, in bringing young people and policy experts together, what would be one thing you would say to each of them? So to young people and to policy experts, to bring them together. Mark and Lesley? Yeah.
I think to young people, in terms of connecting with policy experts, I would say to young people, policy needs you. And I guess I would put that in the context of, I also totally get why a lot of young people are turned off of existing policymaking approaches because their voices are so excluded. And it's important to recognizing and supporting the other ways that young people are getting politically involved. And so while recognizing that, I still want to say that policy needs you, and to encourage all young people to take any kind of chance that they have to get their ideas, their needs and their dreams across to policymakers, because any chance to influence decisions that affect your life is an opportunity. And you're going to have to, as a young person, live with those contemporary policy decisions longer than anybody else. So you have a really strong stake in what gets decided, and you deserve and have a right to have a say.
And for policymakers, Lesley, what would you say to them?
Well, policymakers on the other side, I would say you need young people. And I would say, that, and you can approach that in multiple ways. So we've talked about sort of what do you get out of it, but I think there's also a rights-based element, is that we are in a liberal democracy and people have a right to have a say in decisions that affect their lives. And on the other side of that is the more sort of instrumentalist argument of what are you going to get out of it? Well, what does everybody get out of it? We're so focused right now on rebuilding our economy in this transition and this pandemic. And you see dire predictions about youth unemployment and the long-term effects that's going to have on young people's wealth and economic security going forward. That's going to affect a whole generation of people if that's not addressed. You have tons of young people that have accessed some of or all of, in some cases, their superannuation, which is going to cost them a lot more long term, have had disrupted their education and training, job loss that affects long term. So you can't rebuild an economy without a big proportion of that economy. So if you want to invest in Australia's society, you have to invest in everybody, and young people are a key part of that. So I think, you can tailor the message to what kind of decision maker you're talking to and what kind of deal is going to be finding the most purchase with their current interest.
I absolutely adore that line about you can't rebuild the economy without a big chunk of the economy. I think it's a great way of putting it.
That's basic math, right?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Mark, to you, I guess starting off similar to how Lesley's put it, what would you first say to young people in this space?
Well, what I would say to young people is that, and I guess I've been saying this all along, is that politics isn't just what happens in the party room, and it isn't just what happens on Spring Street. And I would say to politicians that politics isn't just what happens in the party room and isn't just what happens on Spring Street. So it's the same advice for both young people and for politicians and policy makers. But for young people, it's just the realization that what you do, what you care about is politics. What happens in the suburbs, this car park, this facility, this thing that you're doing, it's all political. So don't be afraid to get your hands dirty, to make your voice heard, to make changes to the things that matter most to you in your everyday lives. And for politicians, it's about getting out there. It's not just about talking to fellow political elites, to talking to voters, to talking to sponsors and donors, but talking to people that are truly going to bear the brunt of your political decisions in the years to come. They will one day be the people that are voting for or against you. So from a very crude perspective, you need to engage them. You need to get them on side and hear what they have to say. So the advice is the same for young people and politicians and policy makers, is that politics isn't just this narrow thing that's excluded or separate from our lives. It is our lives. We live in it, time to engage in it. Different ways for different people, but we need to engage in it.
That's amazing, Mark and Lesley. We're going to take your such statements and quotes down. They're amazing quotes.
Perfect. I think that's it from us. Thank you so much, really. And both for, being there very early on with Bridging Us. Mark and Lesley were both people we met with before we even founded Bridging Us and gave us your guidance and input. So thank you again for meeting with us and really sharing your insights, both about the book you've written and more broadly your amazing insights.
It's amazing to see what you guys have done in such a short space of time. And we're really, I'll speak for myself, I'm really happy to have been involved, and also glad, I think Lesley and I were speaking, just glad and very surprised that someone actually read our book.
Yeah, I second that. It's been such a
great book.
It's really, really encouraging and wonderful seeing what you have managed to do in this short period of time. And I love your energy and your enthusiasm and your commitment to these important issues. And I think we're really fortunate to get to connect with you on them.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we really want to promote, but yes, promote and not promote at the same time, but we really want to promote your book because we really understand and realize how important the insights you guys gave in the book. So that obviously with the interview, with the chats that we have as well. And that goes without saying that if you guys need anything from us or from Bridging Us, from us individually, please do reach out to us because we really want to help in any way possible.
I'd love to continue working with you into the future.
For sure, yeah, I agree.
And to end on a funny anecdote about how we came across the book. So I'm a big book nerd, and I always look for book sales. And so there's a cafe at Melbourne Uni, and it's right next to where the co-op was, and they were having a book sale, and I was looking over, and then came across your book, and this is just as we were starting the idea of Bridging Us, and I'm like, Imana, we have to buy this book, and she always tries to persuade me to stop buying more and more books because that's my bias. I spend too much on books, but I'm like, it's too relevant to what we're doing. I have to buy it, and so I bought the book, and then we're fortunately like, oh, most of these professors are in Melbourne. So then we found your emails online. We met with both you for coffee, and the rest is history. Now we're here. So great turn of events for us to meet you.
And we're really happy that you guys also replied to our emails when we asked to catch up and just have a chat about this. So we were really grateful for that. We didn't really think you guys would respond, to be honest.
Yeah, no. Especially Mark. I think Mark emailed us an hour after we emailed him. It's like, is he actually emailing us back?
So thank you so much to you both.
Thank you. Again, for anyone who's joining in, so Mark Chou is Associate Professor of Politics at ACU, and Dr. Lesley Pruitt, Senior Lecturer at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. They are also co-authors of the book Young People's Citizenship and Political Participation, Combating Civil Deficit. We will connect and put their links for both Mark and Lesley's profiles are online, a link to their book as well as an article that Bridging Us wrote about the main insights that we took away from their book. Mark and Lesley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ali and Imana.
Have a great day.
We'll stop the